very nice paper by Helen Nissenbaum, which talks about why accountability is hard in a computerized society. Right? So this is just an example of, right, people have known about the role of accountability from many centuries ago, and what sort of penalty should be enforced if somebody is not accountable, right? Long back, laws of Hammurabi. The laws of Hammurabi are sort of one of the very first codified laws. These laws are basically inscribed in a pillar like this, and this is in the Babylonian civilization many centuries ago. So the point is that to motivate better practices, I mean, one way is that everybody is sort of self-regulated, right? And that's the term typically used, that companies doing it or engineers, technologists doing it, right? We self-regulate ourselves, we take care of what we're doing, and so on, right? The other way is that laws and regulations are created so that, it becomes compulsory, right? To follow certain procedures, to take certain points into account for these better practices, right? So this requires that for any action, you're able to identify, right, whenever it goes wrong, you're able to identify the causal factor. If the agent's actions caused the harm or they were a significant causal factor to it, right? Or the actions were, so there was a cause that could be attributed, and these actions were faulty, either with an intention to hurt someone or reckless and negligent and so on, right? So this is typically how the laws have evolved, that you can make people accountable by putting in laws and regulations in place, but these become possible if you're able to attribute causation, that the person's actions caused this thing, and you're also able to say that these actions were faulty, right, with some malintentions and so on, right? But with computers, this becomes difficult, attributing fault and causation. And so Helen Nissenbaum talks about the problem of many hands, that computer systems are built by many people, right? There's large teams doing it, there's different modules, somebody has done some modules, somebody has done some other modules. Problems also happen, right? A module in itself might be working correctly, but when you compose these modules together, then some unforeseen scenarios, some corner cases that had not been considered, these might come up. So this case of Thirak 25 is a very common case study that is brought up. So this was basically introduction of computers in some radiology equipment. And again, these are like old case studies. This paper itself was in 1996. So Thirak 25 obviously happened much before that. So this radiation therapy actually led to radiation burns because of, among many people, because of malfunctioning equipment. And then when people started probing deeper, they sort of found that when all of these things were composed together, different modules are composed together, that it led to problems, right? We also spoke about Aadhaar last time, right? We spoke about problems that use of Aadhaar-based authentication had caused in welfare exclusion, that people who were entitled to, right, like in PDS, the public distribution system for subsidized food, people who were entitled to it were not able to get it because either the biometrics failed or maybe their names were not registered properly on the ration card. Now, you can again say that, well, the Aadhaar technology in itself might be fine, right? Which is the argument that UIDAI, for example, uses, that Aadhaar is secure, right? Right? If it doesn't work, Aadhaar will always send an error code, right? So it's not our problem that these exclusions have been caused, but it's a problem of the departments who used Aadhaar. So our technology in itself is fine, but services built on top of it actually did not use it properly, right? So essentially, this is one reason why attributing accountability becomes complicated in computers, right? Then you have another reason is bugs, right? Now that and how these bugs come up, it's not like somebody is purposely putting in these bugs, right? These are, I mean, like, to err is human, right? The common idiom that we often hear. How do you figure out, right, which bugs were like faulty or just introduced carelessly, or which bugs just came up, right? Because it's very difficult to think through everything, right? And now there are, of course, tools being built for this, right? So software verification tools, static analysis, dynamic analysis. So there's a lot happening, but yeah, I mean, it is difficult, right? So again, attributing causation might be easy, but attributing fault becomes harder in this case. Yeah, this ultimately leads to very often also a system or a culture of attributing the problem to the computer, right? So the computer becomes a scapegoat. Well, it's not our mistake. The computer made a mistake, right? And then who do you blame, right? Because a computer, you can't really blame the computer, right? You need to blame the people behind the computer or the person who was using the computer. But that has its, like we just saw, right? This problem of many hands and bugs and everything, that becomes harder, right? In general, the culture of culture of innovation is also geared towards rewarding new things, new achievements, but there's less emphasis on failure, right? When innovations fail or they produce problems, right? So this is, of course, it depends, right? In different countries, it's different. But again, it boils down to the social systems you're talking about, right? Capitalism itself encourages innovation, right? Because innovation is fundamental to capitalism's growth. When there is continuous innovation, it means there is replacement. When there is replacement, it means there is new stuff to be built, and therefore there is continuous growth, right? So there is this inherent drive, right, for new innovations, but very often it's not counterbalanced with liability. And you can see then, therefore, that these sorts of things, I think everybody knows that people need to be more responsible, right? But the challenge that we are talking about over here is that why it is hard to enforce responsibility. Yeah. And then we see similar issues coming up in some of the more modern examples that we've seen, right? Like bias data used to build machine learning systems, right? So this is where we spoke about problems of incorrect predictions, right? That systems like face recognition systems we spoke about, they make more mistakes on black people than white people, right? So you can say that, see how ultimately it's hard to attribute fault over here, that who was at fault? The people who created the data sets in the first place, that these data sets were biased to begin with, that there was more data on white people and less on black people, or was it further downstream people who started using it without humans in the loop, without adequate attention paid to the results that were being produced by these systems. So we see similar things coming up. Misuse due to less constrained design. This, I think, is not what the paper doesn't talk about. We've referred to it as affordances. It's also important to think through, right, what flexibilities or constraints to build into the technology itself to prevent misuse. Then what sorts of harms are should we be considering, right? Psychological and sociological effects of systems on society, right? Should we consider those? Why is it difficult to consider these things? Because you'll only notice them once the system has been put into operation and it's working at a large scale, right? And at that point, it might be very difficult to shut down the system that has been put into place. These are some reasons also why, therefore, computer systems become, right, complex. So some things we're talking about. I mean, just some simple things like, right, simpler software, high levels of quality assurance, verification, software verification, right? These are important things. Carefully designed affordances are important. One of the points to think about is how have other industries managed their ethics? We've talked about computers and some unique aspects with computers, but this is one industry, right? There are technologies used in so many different industries. So how have they managed it, right? So here, if we look at medical ethics, right, that's probably the first place where ethics and technology started being talked about. And not just in technology, right? Any medical action that the doctor is going to take, right? So they came up with these 4 principles, right? Just like we can come up with our own principles of like simple software and testing data for biases and so on, right? What principles did the medical ethics community come up with, right? So they said that, well, we need to focus on autonomy, that patient is autonomous in taking the final decision. Justice, right? So this is more in the case of like testing of new treatments, that it shouldn't benefit just somebody and make somebody worse off, right? So there needs to be a notion of justice in what actions are being taken. Beneficence, that ultimately it should benefit the person to whom we are trying to help. And non-maleficence, that it should be done without any intention of harm. So you can start now. I hope you see things coming together, right? That these principles are now really coming from ethics, right? That we know that, okay, computers are complicated systems. There are so many things that we would need to take into account if we have to be ethical in building these systems, right? Taking social systems into account is just so difficult, right? It means that we have to become political agents ourselves to do all this. Plus, it's not easy to enforce everybody to do that because of all of this problem in attributing accountability, fault, and causation. So we do need some principles through which we need to operate. And these principles then are coming from an internal ethos. You might build whatever regulations or laws that you can, but ultimately there you cannot wish away your own ethos that you have to develop, right? So there are some interesting examples. In the 1980s, this technology of recombinant DNA came up. There were, of course, many fears, right? So recombinant DNA is really about gene splicing and combining different DNAs together, and you can imagine the ethical issues that that would raise. So this is a very famous series of conferences that happened called the Asilomar Conference, where they actually put a moratorium on their research on recombinant DNA for 3 or 4 years. So they said that worldwide, right, all scientists, we say that we are not going to do more research on recombinant DNA until we've not figured out the principles with which we will work on this, right? So it's taken as a model conference because it was done not just by the scientists, but they also brought in the civil society. They also brought in members from NGOs and rights organizations and so on to think about, right, what should be these principles, and only when they had this code of conduct in place, right, then they advanced the research further. Similarly, with the development of nuclear weapons, right? So there's a very famous manifesto by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, correct, called the Bertrand-Einstein Manifesto, where they basically talk about nuclear disarmament and why nuclear weapons can be a threat to humanity itself. This manifesto again was signed by many, many Nobel Prize winners and scientists, nuclear scientists around the world. And it led to a series of conferences called the Pugwash conferences, where again, right, these things are discussed, that how should nuclear physicists, right, who are working on these things, right, what principles should they follow? And further, what principles should the industry and countries follow? So these are also some things that you should check out, right? That this is how, like, the medical ethics community, biomedical community, physics community, right? These people have acknowledged the strong influence, impact, possible negative fallouts that technologies can have, and they chose different paths, right? So like complete moratorium that was done in the Asilomar conference, to the Pugwash conferences, which basically led to a lot of policy influence, right? So these were basically scientists who were trying to influence policy, and it had a lot of influence. So in fact, the whole NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which almost so many countries are a signatory to, right? It actually came out of the Pugwash conferences, which was done by the scientists, right? So all this is basically the reason why we're saying all this is ultimately to draw home the point that there is a certain ethos, there is a certain responsibility that technologists need to feel for themselves, and which we need to drive ourselves, and see how we can bring it for wider adoption, right, in laws, in regulations that will get created. So go through all of this again, right? So the point is that, to summarize, right, we've seen all of these things, right, with invisibility, logical malleability, social impact, informatization, and therefore we need to act responsibly. We can draw many principles, but it's hard just to rely on laws and regulations to do that.